G'day guys, this is James here with the Plant Podcast for episode number 2. We have Matt, we have Tris, and we have Shaun, a couple of special guests. These guys are crazy smart, and we've got them in to talk about how they've helped us, myself and Matt, create our very unique plant protein, just to give it a little bit of extra jazz, just to make it even healthier than it already is. So just to start things off, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get these guys to just talk a little bit about themselves, so you guys can understand where they're coming from, what they do at Biome Centric, and basically what their specialty is. So I'm going to give it over to, say, Shaun. You can start us off. Shaun's going to just intro yourself, tell us a little bit about what you've done in the past and what your specialty is.
James, Matt, guys, thanks for the opportunity to sort of talk on this podcast. It's obviously great to see innovators taking and leading in this space and taking the opportunity, you know, to actually collaborate with manufacturers ourselves in the technology space. You know, I guess our journey started a long time ago. It's all to do with, you know, I guess probiotics, postbiotics, and prebiotics, and that whole therapeutic space. And you know, we've got a really big passion for the microbiome. You know, we come from a background of, you know, manufacturing for all the leading brands as a contract manufacturer. And, you know, that's sort of our background. And obviously part of that, we've sort of set up, you know, growing the first bacteria plant that's sort of GMP certified in the world. We were part of that journey as well. So that's sort of where sort of the brainchild of Biome Centric started. You know, there's so many different brands out there, but they manufacture inferior products. Like, it's just, you know, I think some of the products in the market is like, it's a lot of hype around a product, and sometimes there's no substance to that product. And so, you know, we had the opportunity, we could either be in a brand or be something, but because of our sort of exposure to the market, we wanted to collaborate with brands as yourself. And that's been the opportunity, because the only way we can spread the goodness or the love in this space, like, and to understand the microbiome, because I think the microbiome space is such a young space at this stage, but the opportunity is massive. And with people realizing, with the latest research and technology has been coming to light, people are understanding, like, the importance of the gut microbiome, the skin microbiome, and how it has to interact. I guess just the overall importance. So at Biome Centric, what we've done is, you know, we focus on that gut-skin axis, and that's sort of the number one priority. We focus on that everything microbiome. So we look at the, you know, from an environmental perspective, like the biome supporting the whole ecosystem being sustainable. You know, so we help brands develop new innovative products, focusing on fermentation and bacteria, probiotics, prebiotics, postbiotics, and coming up with real innovative, you know, new products and new materials that can obviously help and support, you know, I guess those brands. And at the end of the day is, we want to be that support system, you know, so whatever the brand is out there, you know, that's what we love. Our passion is to spread it across in different sectors. We operate in lots of different segments in the market. And to give you an example, you know, some of the things we're passionate about is like skin microbiome. So skin microbiome, people don't realize, you know, you go to your house and you pull off organic shampoo or shampoo. Have you ever really researched the ingredients that goes on? It's all chemical compounds that's sort of captured in. And how does it disrupt your skin microbiome? For example, the intake, the things that we eat, you know, what is happening to the microbiome? It's obviously, we are more bacteria than that, you know, I guess some human genome cells. And the important is, like, what's that role playing? And I guess, long story short, it's like we don't have...
That's super interesting. Well, just tacking onto that, so stuff that we put on our skin, we can actually, we're absorbing the stuff that's on our skin, especially if it's like chemical. Let's take sunscreen, for instance. The stuff that we put in sunscreen, we put it on our skin to help us protect us from sunburn. But how much of those chemicals are passing through the skin and going into our bloodstream, and are those chemicals somewhat, are they okay? How are we processing them? What is it doing? Is it disrupting other things, other systems in our body at the same time? That's the thing we've got to kind of think about as well, right?
You think about, like, I guess you look at the sun, obviously affecting the skin, obviously producing vitamin D3. That's having an effect on the gut microbiome. That's changing that composition, just being exposed to the sun. So, and people don't realize that the gut microbiome, the skin microbiome, it's such an important aspect of what we're talking about. So whether it be, and the thing about bacteria, it's such an amazing area. I mean, everything around us, it's bacteria. And if it wasn't for those bacteria, the world we live in will be a completely different, it will completely be different. So it's very important from that perspective. So Biome Centric is all about, helping creating new bioactive compounds, whether it's in cosmetics or whether it's in nutraceuticals or functional foods, specializing in fermentation. And we love to collaborate with brands that are really passionate about that. And there's a whole, they call it the era of the microbiome. And it's not for nothing. It's because the microbiome and the latest research shows us the importance of the microbiome. And that's what we harness. So we're that beacon, especially in Australia and obviously globally, working to showcase that and that capability. And obviously, and it's obviously really proud to be able to share this journey with a brand as yourself. And the stuff that we do together is obviously amazing.
Oh, it's going to be great. So this is the thing. I met Shaun a long time ago. He kept Trist secret for quite a while. It's like a little secret weapon in the back. Yeah. But we talked a lot about ideas and concepts that hadn't yet been developed. So about 2,500 years ago, I think it was Hippocrates, some guy there, he reckons there's something in these fermented foods that help to support our gut health, and through our gut health we can achieve systemic health. I think it was 2021, so just last year. I think August last year is when they finally decided to give the proper definitions to what the difference between a probiotic, which is the live bugs, the prebiotic food, the postbiotic, which is the stuff made from these guys, and then these ghost zombie bugs, which we're going to get Tris to explain to us in a sec. So it was only like August last year that the information and the world started agreeing with the crazy ideas that Shaun and I had been discussing about for a long time about postbiotics. Why does it have to be live bugs? What are the dead bugs doing? What's the acids that are made through these products? What are the other enzymes? What are these other things? And we had a lot of ideas and belief systems about how the industry could be different. And it just took a long time for that science to catch up. But in the meantime, we kind of like all had similar beliefs and similar ideas. And now we've come into a position where we've got the data. It's all starting to catch up. Science is almost smart enough to understand small parts of nature. And explain a couple of things, and science is so far behind explaining how nature does what nature does. But that's where we're learning so much more. And that's why it's handy having someone like Tris that's just dedicated their life to this shit. Literally. Yeah. Like he just focuses in on that.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it's super interesting. And just before I let Tris intro himself and talk about some gut bugs and bacteria and stuff, just so I'm clear, and this is probably for a lot of people out there just like me, and a lot of what is said is going to be like, it doesn't make sense just yet, but it will, especially as we talk about this stuff more, which is going to be a hot topic for us. So just quickly, a bacteria, how does that differ from an enzyme? Like, is that what is created? Is that, well, maybe that's a good segue for you to introduce yourself, and then we can talk about the difference between a bacteria and what an enzyme is, because as just someone who's just been an athlete, never done any tertiary study, I would just say food goes in, it is either protein, carbohydrates, fat, then you've got vitamins and minerals, and then the enzymes come over to those carbohydrates, they lock themselves in, they twist around, they break it apart, and then your body does something with it. That's as far as most people will probably get. So maybe this is a good way for you to intro yourself, talk a little bit about what you studied, and then maybe just explain a little bit about that.
Sure. So yeah, as you guys have alluded to, so obviously my background is in microbiology, microbial ecology specifically. So my PhD was looking at microbial ecology, actually of soils. So looking at these like unculturable bacteria from soil, because back then we didn't really know a lot about bacteria. Like what you could culture in the lab was kind of like the knowledge, but sequencing technology started to improve. And we started to be able to sequence the genes that are present from these bacteria. So people may have heard of like 16S sequencing and these kinds of things. So that's looking at specific markers within the organisms that tells you, based on evolution of that gene, what those are essentially. So those technologies started to improve probably from like mid to early 2000s. Cost of that sequencing decreased, and the capabilities and the capacity of those things increased. So our knowledge of that whole group of organisms started to increase. So we started to realize that, oh, there's a whole lot of these things that we can grow on a plate, E. coli and things you've all probably heard of. But
Corona.
There's
edit that bit out.
Sure. Yeah, we can
A
go
virus.
But then there's a big chunk that we can't. And then we only know about them through this molecular work. So part of my work was looking at sort of, understanding some of these organisms that are not culturable in the lab traditionally, trying to culture them. So that's kind of like my original background through my PhD. And then working through with the Antarctic Division and other groups and universities, looking at microbial ecology in soils, understanding how they interact with different organisms in the soil, plants, how they respond to climate change, how they respond to like pollutants and things like that. And then I kind of like being very interested in human microbiome space, started to sort of look towards this, like obviously I want to learn a bit more about myself and my health and these sorts of things. And the human microbiome started to take off with the Human Microbiome Project. People like Rob Knight looking at all these things globally, people studying people's poop and seeing what's in there and what are they doing. So my interest in that started to increase, and then I started to work with Shaun. As he mentioned, we were looking in this probiotic manufacturing site and looking at how we can use these as therapeutics. But a big part of that is understanding their interaction with the microbiome, understanding the microbiome. So our experience with that side of things, regulatory side of things, basically has been like my career for the last 15 years or so. And then essentially that sort of brings us to today. Looking at microbiome science, it's definitely in its infancy in terms of a science, really. So, like as Shaun said, we're sort of scratching the surface. You guys have had these ideas that are starting to somewhat get validated by scientific research, and people are starting to go, oh, hang on, there's this big sort of like elephant in the room about health and everything that we haven't really looked at. So now it's kind of coming to the forefront. But to go over to your other question, so defining some of these things, right? Like people throw these terms around, what's a microbiome, what's a bacteria, what's an enzyme? Microbiome, just to sort of define that, is essentially the name given to the genomic composition of all of the microbes in an environment. That could be your gut, that could be soil, that could be your skin. So the microbiome, O-M-E, that's the genome. That's the genomic portion of it. Microbiota is the actual organisms themselves. So when we, those tend to get used interchangeably, but those two basically mean the live organisms or the genome that's present when you sequence a sample, essentially. Bacteria is a microbe. It's essentially a single-cell organism, and basically they're like fully functioning. They do everything they need to do, interact with the environment. They're responsive to their environment. They can grow into colonies or they can grow planktonically. And essentially they're a fully functioning cell that functions as an organism. Same as you and me interacting with the environment, but basically they are like self-contained. An enzyme is basically a protein complex that will be able to interact with other molecules and generally break them down. So if you're looking at carbohydrates, for instance, you get like amylases that will break down a carbohydrate into simple components that then we can absorb, or not necessarily for us to absorb, but maybe for our microbiome to use indirectly. So that's that kind of general definition there. But basically that's sort of, there's a lot of probably new words for a lot of people in this space. And part of our sort of, work in terms of obviously developing these ingredients and developing these processes and helping brands is education. And so I think people probably don't really know much about this space. And so there's not so much sort of foray into this space just yet because people aren't aware of a lot of these concepts and the impact that they have. But
I think one of the things we're saying is like we work with this every day. So for us, it's like, it's a no-brainer. Like it's a no-brainer. Don't you see the potential?
Yeah.
It's and I guess when that light goes on, and it's like Matt, me and you,
Oh,
you
mate.
know.
I know. I was having these arguments at the late 90s with scientists, just as we were about to launch probiotic supplements, saying, but what about the dead portion? Or like, what actually is it? Because you've only told me a couple of 100 milligrams of this powder. What's the rest of it, And how do you know it's not that doing stuff? But some of the things, just again to explain further for the listeners with the enzymes and that you're talking about before, so this is the beauty of the microbiome. Now, we talk about the genomes and that, with the human genome being about 22,000 genes. Our genome takes like maybe 100,000 years to like adapt to our environment or something like that through, Darwin theories. However, our microbiome, we've got about 3.3 million genes in there that our body can recruit. So where our pancreas might make a series of enzymes that's capable of breaking down certain nutrients, if we're lacking enzymes that we require to break down a specific food, or that the bacteria need to break down a specific food that they want to feed, and then they're capable often of making those enzymes and even changing the changing your microbiome by changing the ratios and the populations of the different species, and then it will adapt to your new diet or adapt to the diet and actually start creating the enzymes that you're lacking that might break down some of the anti-nutrients in a food that might be blocking the microbes from getting what they want. It's not all about us. I mean, a lot of the time the bugs are just making stuff for themselves, and actually that's where the overgrowth of the bugs can come in problematic, because we start competing with them for their preferred food sources and linking to things like insulin and that, which we'll cover in multiple podcasts. We need to get a bit more to the basics.
So that's interesting. So that kind of comes back with what we were talking about when, let's just say that you eat just a very stock standard and repeated diet day in, day out for months on end. Then you were to, and say your gut bugs, they're feeding on that particular food. They're getting fed particular food as a, say, prebiotic, which your food is the prebiotic to fuel those guys. Then you were to add something completely different into your diet and it doesn't sit well on you. Let's just say you get bloated or you get, for me, it was like chickpeas was the number one thing. I never had chickpeas. I had chickpeas once and I got super bloated from it. Is that because I don't have the right microbiome makeup to break that stuff down, or in that's just sitting in there doing something? What's the go typically with that type of stuff? Like if we were to introduce or an intolerance, we call it intolerant, like a milk intolerance or lactose intolerance, or maybe like a high phytic acid or phytate food like chickpeas, something like that.
Or even oxalates. And anytime we make a massive change in our diet, even changing from one season to another, sometimes when we first start binging, our body can be a little bit intolerant to a food. The difference with an intolerance, it basically means we're struggling to break it down, to which we then have partially broken down things that will trigger the immune system to try to create a flushing reaction. Or sometimes in the case of things like lactose or with the chickpeas, if we can't break down a particular sugar out of it, it'll ferment by those microbes until we're capable of making those enzymes. And sometimes the initial intolerance that then becomes into something that we can tolerate is the actual changing of our microbiome. And we, for example, we acquire the bugs that we need to break down lactose or break down the other sugars. And then when we avoid those foods for a period of time, those microbes will die off. Or if you never eat those foods, those microbes might starve off. So the problem with having a balanced diet but not a varied diet is that you can build up particular strains can be overgrown, and other strains that never get the fuel that they need never grow at all.
See, that's the thing is it's this power and diversity of the microbes.
Yeah.
And you'll see all the clinical evidence and the data and the studies out there. The more diverse your microbiome is, whether it's your gut microbiome or skin microbiome, it's associated with health.
Yep.
And that's why it's important, like the foods and the things we eat and what we put in our skin, what we interact, how we interact, and what are we feeding those microbes. Because otherwise, without that diversity, it's just, you're introducing all these negative things.
And the reason why that they're pointing at, that they're talking about, like I said in the papers from August late last year, they were saying that it's possibly the postbiotic compounds that are made. So the more variety of bugs that you have, and you get that by eating a bigger variety of food, which we'll call prebiotics when we want to be scientific, so we'll be feeding these prebiotic foods to them. The more variety you get there, the more variety of microbes that you'll colonize and grow, which means the more variety of chemicals, compounds, metabolites, fatty acids, and all these crazy, amazing things we're still discovering. Things like glutathiones and vitamin B12 and vitamin Ks, and all these things are made by those bugs. So the more diverse, the more different strains of bugs that you have, the more capability you have to make a bigger, diverse postbiotic matrix, which means you've got a much better ability to actually provide the tools that your body might need to overcome some sort of a stress or something like that.
That's super cool. And I think this is probably tacking on to what you were studying in your PhD. We've spoken about this once before, Matt, and we have, we can test our microbiome. I'm going to do a microbiota test and see what's going on in there. But we also find that it's very important to test what's coming out at the end. So making sure we can take a look at that and to see, we might get a better idea on overall health by seeing what's coming out the other end than just seeing what's in there at the moment, because along the way there's obviously some changes that happen. So
it's not what you are. That's what we decided the other podcast. It's not what is it? You are what you eat. It's like you are what you poop. Because it's more determined how your body takes those prebiotic substrates and what it does with them. You know, we talked about like in some episodes of podcast, I lose my mind how much I talk. I don't even know anymore. So, you know, like carnitine can get hijacked by a particular bug and turned to TMAO, which causes hardening in the arteries. Instead of carnitine stimulating carnitine palmital transferase to burn fat, it'll make a thing that causes hardening in the arteries. So, choline, that's supposed to make you smart, can cause dementia if it goes down the wrong pathway. It's all to do with the bugs that you have.
And so just talking about carnitine for 2 seconds and how that comes about. So what is carnitine? Where do we get it from? And how do we make sure it goes down the right pathway?
Oh, I know what he's setting a trap. Oh, I know what's happening. Yes, carnitine comes from meat, James.
It doesn't matter for me and Tris.
But choline, let's talk about choline instead.
Okay, fair enough.
Because it comes from legumes. No, and it comes from the eggs and that. But you know when they say like you can't eat eggs, it causes heart disease, or don't eat too many nuts because it causes heart disease, because they're going, oh, we've worked out that there's these choline components that can go down this wrong pathway. But that's also why they say we should eat the nuts and that sort of stuff with the skin on, because these polyphenols on the outside can control the bugs and control those pathways. You know, with the meat, when you can buy the meat, combine meat with things like garlic, ginger, a lot of other herbs and spices, they all actually help to control the microbiome that controls the pathway the carnitine goes down. Actually, Anthony Almada did a wicked study showing how he can increase carnitine absorption into muscles by combining it with sugar. And everyone was like, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, it's like a bizarre thing. But it turns out that if you combine your carnitine with sugar, the bugs are so busy feeding on the sugar, the carnitine slips through. So it's like crazy to think how a balanced diet and a varied diet and changing a diet is so important, and then incorporating all the other bits and pieces for the microbiome.
So for things that like is carnitine, for instance, do we have to consume that? Because we're not getting that out of plants, are we? We're not getting any carnitine really.
No, you're not getting carnitine, but you make it. It's not one of the essentials.
We can make it? Yeah, cool. Okay, cool. So we can use other proteins to make that one.
Yeah,
okay, sweet.
Yeah, something like creatine and that. It's made out of the other amino acids as well. Yeah.
So going back to that, just talking about the soil that you were looking at for bacteria, for instance, is the microbiome in the soil? Is that Yep. So microbiome in the soil, is that the same types of bacteria and bugs that are in our gut?
No. There may be some that we do, like, well, maybe depending on the populations that you look at, for instance, where, you know, you're not like, let's go back. Sorry. If we look at a Western lifestyle where we sanitize everything, our food is washed and all that sort of stuff, and we very little interact with the environment, probably not. But if we look at sort of like the human animal, for instance, it probably would be some overlap in some of those species, but obviously there's a lot of there's different substrates in the soil, and so it's a completely different ecosystem. So
what about dead ones, Tris?
The
postbiotics from the soil and that.
Yeah, potentially they could be some things, but I guess there's nothing. Obviously, postbiotic is going to just pass through you, and there's obviously zero colonization. So if you were continually consuming them and you did a microbiota test, then you may pick those up. But I don't think that they're part of like the core microbiome in general.
So it's the same everywhere, hey? So like, if we get, if we have microbiome in our stomach, microbiome in our soil, if we have a fermented food on a bench, and then we're talking about our skin, it's a similar recipe. We got prebiotic, which is their fuel.
Absolutely.
We have the live organisms that kind of have to be there to be fed, and they'll come from either the environment or on the food or from mum or wherever we got them originally. And then we need a series of an environment like acid. You know, we look at pH levels and temperatures and all those sort of things that will allow that the brewing to occur.
Definitely.
And then it creates postbiotic metabolites.
Yeah.
Is it something to keep in mind? Like obviously, like you were saying before, like the term postbiotic, for years people have been referring to for sorts of different names like Probiotics and Postbiotics and, you know, inactivated, heat treated, tandalized, all these different types of what they call the postbiotic. And I guess last year, and obviously we've been strong advocates of promoting the word postbiotics. And I guess with our efforts, you know, we've basically put together the Wikipedia page, and so that people can get an understanding of what it is. And then after the Wikipedia page was put together about postbiotics and all the references and showing the science, we just did that work to put it all together. And then obviously the International Probiotics Association published a paper in Nature and obviously defining postbiotics. And if you look at postbiotics, essentially, if you want to break it down, the two things, postbiotics, you can either refer to as the dead cell. So you've got your live organism, but that live organism, the moment you kill it, or deactivate it, that is classified as a postbiotic. But a postbiotic can also be classified as when a bacteria grows, as it's growing on a certain substrate or substrates, it excretes metabolites and these wonderful bioactive compounds that comes out, and 1,000 different compounds it produce. And that's also called postbiotic. So it's got these postbiotics as two categories, and sometimes people need to be aware there's these two categories, because sometimes they refer to the one as the deactivated cell, but the value lies not just in the one. It's like it's that combined, it's that metabolite solution and the actual deactivated bacteria. Maybe Tris, we can explain about the mechanism, how it worked, why the deactivated bacteria, why is it so effective compared to a live bacteria, because it's not competing. But maybe talk a little bit about it.
I mean, I think like it's probably, to be definitive about it, is a bit sort of overreaching, but certainly the sort of mechanisms of actions of probiotics are boiled down to the things that they do, right? The things that they produce. So if you're looking at probiotic functioning, let's talk about, for instance, short-chain fatty acids, one of the most known about metabolites that they produce, and that's probably well studied in their interaction with humans. Those things are actually what's sort of doing the good work. If you look at that, say, fermenting in a solution, it's going to be excreting a lot of that. So lactic acid, acetic acid, butyric acid, propionic acid, these things are the things that are the sort of gold part of what the probiotics do. Not only that, but when you sort of deactivate that cell, then potentially you're going to, as you consume that cell will get busted open in your gut. And then there's a whole load of cellular components that can interact with us. So things like the various peptides that they produce, so there's antimicrobial peptides, or there's things that are embedded in the cell membrane that interact with other bacteria in your gut. So that cell of the probiotic actually is a massive bolus of prebiotic essentially for your gut. So not only is there that direct interaction with us as a host, those chemicals, those molecules and signaling components, but also the components of the probiotic cell act as that sort of food for the thing. So
like
not
a
only
compost, almost like compost to allow
exactly
your
like
microbiome
So
grow.
I think if we think about the microbiome as an ecosystem, and a soil ecosystem is quite a good one, like a garden or a forest or something like that, that's rich and diverse. When things are functioning well, everything's in this nice balance, right? Eubiosis is the term that's usually used for balance, and dysbiosis is the term that's used for unbalanced community. So if you look at that balance, you've got things, nothing really is overshooting anything else, right? Like if something overgrows, that system gets out of balance, and then it's sort of something will come along either to correct itself or that system will collapse.
Yep.
But in a balancing ecosystem, everything's competing against each other, or some things are like sort of harmonious with each other. And that's kind of essentially what you want in the gut, right? That diversity that we talk about, that comes from, some probiotics or some commensals, interacting with the fiber that we eat. Some of them also interacting with the fiber, producing like antimicrobial peptides that control those opportunistic pathogens. So that whole thing is like working nicely. So when you're just feeding just the foods, you get a portion of that story. But if you take those probiotics and you put them into the gut, and we could call them as postbiotics, you get their metabolites on top of that. You get all of their cellular components on top of that. So you're basically adding this rich compost, really great analogy there, to fuel that environment a lot better and create a lot more diversity when you're basically feeding everything in there. If you think about just giving, like if we just went to a garden and we just put like one type of fertilizer on there, some things will grow well, other things will be neglected, right? So you're sort of satisfying that.
But also in saying that, it's also important, the bacteria. Sometimes, I guess we've got a genus, we've got obviously a strain level, or like species level and a strain level. And sometimes you so many different products on the market, and people just throw in a species level or just throw in the genus, and people talk about probiotics. The word probiotics is like sometimes when I look at products and look at the industry, it's been so abused. And I guess what we, being an advocate for postbiotics, we hope that postbiotics don't get abused that way, because there's a whole different spectrum. I mean, I heard, I've been talking to, some of the regulatory, and the questions that brands are asking them. how can we call our existing product a postbiotic?
Exactly.
That's
and the bigger risk, isn't it?
That's the thing, is because obviously probiotics are live, and in that product they will deteriorate. And now all of a sudden they can call it a postbiotic. No, it's like you need to understand.
Well, at first they tried to say postbiotics don't work, but then we reminded them that there's never been any probiotic study that's had exclusively live bugs. So every potential benefit you found from a live probiotic in a study potentially could have come from the dead portion, because when they count these 35 billion organisms, they're often formulating with 100 billion. So that way they can get down to 35 around expiry or even more. So we already know there's a lot more dead in these things than live, especially at any stage of these products' life cycle. The ratios between live and dead, we have no idea. And so there's never been any studies where they can definitively say live bugs do this. The only way they can identify it is by killing those formulas and then comparing it to what the dead ones do, and they're finding very similar results in many cases. One thing that's really interesting about what you were saying before, that so this gut, if we use the analogy of a garden, and the compost and the soil, when James goes and does his poop test at Microba and they tell him he's got an overgrowth of some Clostridiums or Candidas or something like that, a few years ago, like a couple of decades ago, we would have been told to go and get a Lactobacillus plantarum at as many billions of these things as you can find, and we're going to throw it at it and it's going to fix it. In my experience, it doesn't work. The analogy of that is like a farmer walking up to a weed, throwing grass seeds at it, expecting these weeds to just kind of get up and go. So that's why probiotics, postbiotics, gut health is only a small part of it, because if we don't having the regular changes in the diet, if we're not using these antimicrobial polyphenols and that sort of stuff as well to kind of control that population, or if our gut microbiome has gone so far out of whack, that it's really hard to reestablish, then when we do change to a healthy diet, we don't always have the right microbiome to deal with it, and then you go through those phases of bloating, and they'll talk about getting worse before you get better, but we still got to work through that process to build the proper colonies of bugs to make all the postbiotic metabolites we need to break down those variety of diets. And that comes from the soils as well. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, because is this almost like, so say we've got this harmonious garden that is balanced and it doesn't have something, getting way out of whack and something growing way too much. Let's say, is that like the health to sickness axis? So let's just say we've got a really harmonious, balanced gut microbiome, and we're in health here, but then something has triggered us to grow particular strands of bacteria way too much and they overgrow. It's like you got all these weeds growing in your garden now. Would that send us into the starting to get sicker phase, and things like pathogens can start to overtake, and that's where we start to get run down and get a cold because things aren't working harmoniously in our gut? Is that the type of thing we're looking at here?
Highly likely scenario. Yeah, basically that overgrowth, that dysbiosis, it has such a strong interaction with us. I mean, there's well-established links to the gut-brain axis, there's the gut-skin axis, but there's also a strong link to immunity as well. So, the microbiome and all of those components they produce, they help modulate our immune system, which is why sort of sidestepping a little bit of that whole hygiene hypothesis of us growing up with, not being exposed to environmental organisms and things like that, conditioning the immune system and developing the microbiome leads to things like allergies, for instance. So those kind of things, exactly right. That dysbiosis leads to generally, probably like overstatement, but generally poor health or some markers of health would decrease for sure.
Well, it's things like when you get a cold.
Yep.
It's like when you're growing up and you get a cold and your grandma says, "Here, have some ginger, have some garlic, have some of this stuff. That's going to make you feel better." It's like, maybe we should just be having those things all the time, because maybe they do help us regulate, the types of gut bugs that we have to not overgrow, and, maybe getting some polyphenols and things in there to help keep things under control and not getting out of whack with too much of this stuff.
Definitely. But it's the diversity is the key. You could just go, okay, let's say ginger and garlic are amazing. Let's just pump the hell out of those. But no, you kind of need to span that thing. So the American Gut Project years ago looked at what constitutes and what helps a healthy microbiome. They looked at population, obviously, of sequencing people's poop, and 30 or more foods, fruits, vegetables, things per week was associated with a healthy and diverse microbiome, and 10 or fewer was usually associated with poorer diversity. And so that diversity of the microbiome, like how many different species do you have in your gut? That's kind of one of the biggest indicators that is your microbiome healthy. That's the thing that sort of helps keep things from getting out of whack, and gives us that functional diversity in the gut. So the number of species is an important thing, but also what they can do. So all of these like metabolic pathways and processes that they can do in our gut and how they interact with our food is what's going to lead to obviously overall gut health and then systemic.
And something I guess I see with people out there, like obviously they take a kefir, they take a kombucha, and they think that's I'm taking my probiotic, I'm taking my postbiotic. But if you sequence a kombucha, we do a full genomic sequence on a kombucha, and you look at the bacteria that's in there. I mean, Tris, what you've seen in kombuchas, like how safe is kombuchas really?
Well, I guess it's a bit of a depends kind of scenario for sure, but like it really depends on the manufacturing and the quality and these kinds of things. But there are definitely going to be, you're using like black tea, for instance. That's what sterilized is obviously going to come with like potential pathogens like Bacillus cereus and things like that. So Clostridium, you're going to get potential toxins. So if that fermentation doesn't happen just right, the pH drop enough, you're going to potentially get these things producing toxins. Things like kombucha, also there's a lot of things like biogenic amines, so histamine, tyramine, those kind of things which we know have like responses in the gut and can cause systemic inflammation and irritation, things like that. So definitely like those things that are seen as almost like a panacea are probably oversold in terms of their sort of health benefits. For sure there's going to be good things, but it's not your like replacement for a specific and diverse selection of like a probiotic.
Interesting. So just having a kombucha every day, you'd probably maybe having, let's say it's a good kombucha and it's got good quality everything, they've done the right thing, it comes out good, but having that same thing every day is probably not the best thing to do.
I mean, you potentially could. You wouldn't want a lot of it because obviously you're just essentially just pumping a lot of one thing. Like it's the one thing that we want to try to avoid. So, have a kefir, have a kombucha, have some sauerkraut, have other fermented, kimchi and those sorts of things, like gochujang, the fermented chili, like all those kind of things. That's going to give you a large diversity of those kind of like positive probiotic microbes. But also, if we're talking about fermented foods and the postbiotic message, right, what's actually good about that fermentation process, right? It's probably partly is the story of the probiotics that we're going to be getting from that, but it's all those postbiotic metabolites. So they're taking that food and they're breaking it down. So A, they're making a lot of the nutrients more accessible to us, and B, they're producing a lot of these metabolites that are beneficial for us as well. So you're consuming this thing as like a supercharged version of cabbage if you're having sauerkraut, or like chilies and things if you're having kimchi. So definitely it's a really good thing to consume overall for the postbiotic benefit, but it's probably overplayed each one to say this is the,
that's the reason I always at Biome Centric, what we do is we try and focus on that particular bacterium or that particular strain that produce certain metabolites as postbiotics, and choose a substrate that obviously is meaningful, because the substrate plays such a important role. I mean, obviously people can ferment things on milk, on different substrates and different complex compositions. I mean, in our line of business, we obviously optimize bacteria growth by feeding them the right composition of food to encourage that particular species of bacteria to grow at optimum. And we target certain things like branched chain fatty acids and branch fats and all sorts of different things that we are looking for in those compounds that they produce. But you have to select the substrate and control the process, because
organism for that substrate.
Exactly, and for the right organism, because a lot of people out there, they don't even know what substrate is grown on, because the manufacturers out there, we're coming from that background, so we know what goes on in that space. Ask your manufacturer what substrate their bacteria is grown on. They won't disclose it because it's their intellectual property. It's all these things that's been the industry keeps so secretive. And having that insight in it and to know what really actually happens behind the scenes, it's so important.
Shaun just answered your original question. So when you were saying, so when someone changes their diet and we have these reactions and stuff, so what we're saying is that you got to match the right fuel with the right probiotic to make the right postbiotic compounds. If you can have bad guts that will hijack good food, so you have the wrong bugs, they will take your food and turn it into a toxic metabolite. That's where these old sayings, one man's medicine's another man's poison. It's to do with what the body chooses to do with those substrates. So the cool thing is what these guys can do in a lab situation or in a benchtop. They can select specific substrates, prebiotic fibers and that sort of stuff with other polyphenol components or whatever modifying compounds. They put it in with the probiotics, and that way they'll make sure it gets made into the right postbiotic metabolites. But in your gut, we have 500 to 1,000 different species of microbes that are constantly living there. You've got all these prebiotics. The biggest nutritional gap we have in society is the fiber gap, but no one wants to talk about what's attached to the fiber. So everyone's putting the fiber back in as these clean white bits of cardboard or, I don't know, roughage or whatever they want to call it. But fiber in food is normally attached to the polyphenols that give the colour, the smell, the fragrance, all the volatile components that's in fresh food. That all lives in with the fibre. The fibre has to hold on to all those sort of things. And a lot of those polyphenols, and that we'll call them anti-nutrients, they bind onto the nutrients so they don't wash away and stuff like that. It's like crazy things. But so in a lab situation, you can custom make these things. In your body, when you make a quick change to your diet, all of a sudden, if you haven't adjusted your gut microbiome to deal with those new changing prebiotics and postbiotics, the acids, the enzymes that Shaun's talking about, they're made by the microbiome in your stomach. We need a very acid stomach, and then it goes alkaline, and then it goes acid again. We need these compartments so it can shift through. These guys are capable of doing this on a bench top, which takes out some of the variability. So when we custom make or custom create the right blends of bugs in the right trade secret process, we can create the right postbiotic compounds that the body needs to support the breakdown, digestion, and utilization of that predetermined or the target substrate or fuel. Yeah.
And like, I guess to comment on that, I mean, as an example, like, we develop a new skincare range, and traditionally we all know aloe vera is good for the skin, but how do we, let's call it the common tacky word, supercharge aloe vera. We go and look at aloe vera and then select the right bacteria that can metabolize aloe vera as a material, as a substrate, and converting that into like a fermented aloe vera and producing, those bioactive compounds through the metabolites produced when it's fermenting. That basically creates this beautiful new material that you're taking something from a standard aloe vera that's got these bioactive compounds, and you're giving it that extra charge by fermenting it on the right bacteria. The bacteria is consuming that substrate. And, we all know the studies out there, when something is fermented, the bioavailability becomes so much more. I mean,
exactly, yeah. So, you can look at studies of things like pomegranate. The antioxidant activity when you ferment that pomegranate increases drastically from when you just have the raw fruit. And I think the other component and the advantage of having postbiotics like this is, you may have experienced it when you've, had that huge bolus of chickpeas and you got like a lot of raffinose there. Something's opportunistic, takes advantage of that, ferments that. Maybe the outcome of that isn't desirable, but what we can do is we can control those fermentation conditions. You can make sure that you get the right metabolites that you're looking for out of that substrate, first of all. Secondly, you may not have the bacteria in your gut, like if you've been neglecting your diversity of fruits and veggies for the last 20 years, for instance, those things may have died off. Or you may never have had them to begin with. And so if we give you that fruit or veggie, you may not be able to process that into the correct metabolite in your gut that would have the health benefits that you'd be looking for. So by controlling that outside, you can amplify that fermentation process, obviously with a large scale with a lot more organisms. Like if you look in the gut, the abundance of the microbes interacting with each thing is much, much lower than it would be in a controlled fermentation. We're talking logs difference of bacteria. And then the outcome is much more tightly controlled as well. So you're getting a direct endpoint. There's no other organisms in the way interacting with that fermentation process. It's just like one or two or whatever we want it to be. So it's much more specific. So you're kind of really targeting it to give you that sort of deliberate health outcome of that source material rather than just letting maybe it happen in the gut.
Yeah, I guess obviously we all know, the first 3 years of our life, that's when the skin, the gut microbiome is formed. That is the pinnacle. That's so important, that's, I guess, where mother's milk comes into play, of forming that gut microbiome where, I guess, the difference between birth canal, cesarean versus...
First mouthful on the way out.
That's the critical part. And that first 3 years of your life, that sort of forms that microbiome, and that's sort of going to stay with you the rest of your life. And because after that, sometimes your body will see that as foreign bodies trying to invade the body if you want to try and introduce, even if they're good species. And that's kind of why we have to keep on taking some of these, let's call it supplements or different things and healthy lifestyles, because if you don't have those things that colonize the gut back then, you're going to have these, well, you're going to have to find things, and I guess like that compost, you're going to have to keep on
Yeah.
bringing in compost
Yeah.
to feed the microbes. And if they don't have, and that's the difference between live organisms and the metabolites, because you're bringing that, the compost or the metabolites, because your bacteria in your gut might not necessarily be producing those metabolites. But if we produce those metabolites outside of the body in a manufacturing setting, in a lab setting, and then take that compounds and introduce it back into the diet, you are getting those benefits from those microbes that you didn't get. You know, and that brings up the door. I mean, look at AKK. I mean, don't go there.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and if you start us on AKK, we're going nuts. So what's really important about it is when you do it in that situation and you make that fermentation on a bench, we're talking about creating the postbiotic compounds that can provide the health benefits. We've got the dead microbes in amongst that can work on maintaining gut wall integrity, work like compost for the live bugs, all of them supporting the live bugs. There'll be some live bugs coming through. All of those sort of things together can go back and help fortify or support a healthy microbiome that will aid the digestion of those particular materials. And you'll see this is the traditionally way it was done, is we grow a heap of cabbage or something like that when it's in season, and then we'll eat as much cabbage as we can while it's fresh, and the rest of it we'll ferment and everything, and then we'll eat that and make it last, and that will actually keep our gut primed, keep our gut good for when cabbage season comes back next year. And that's pretty much the cycle that we've been running from a long time. And then the whole soil stuff is going to be the new frontier, because, I mean, I'm obsessed with shilajit. Like, that's my favorite, one of my favorite herbs of all time, shilajit, which is basically dirt, fermented dirt. So we're going to have a whole talk about that. We also can talk more about traditionally fermented things. Like, they're finding these urolithins, are these postbiotic compounds that come out of oak barrels, like when you ferment your pomegranates and they're the main active ingredients. Guess what? That's what they also discovered in things like shilajits. They're finding a lot of the traditional herbs that are made through traditional techniques of creating a lot of postbiotic compounds. That's how they do their work. They'll always talk about the lack of absorption of natural medicine. It's not bioavailable, you know the word, yep. Bioavailable. And so then they got to try to tweak it with black pepper or something, you know what I mean? But no, once we understand the microbiome, we understand the process of how these things work within the gut and how much we can achieve within that gut region to have systemic effects. That's where the full frontier of medicine is going to be moving towards, I believe. 2,500 years later, we're just getting our head around that. We trust the science. You know?
Yeah, look, I guess we would love to come back and we'll talk about a bit of the skin gut access.
Make us look, you guys are way too smart.
Talk about, obviously, some of our diagnostic tools that we're developing and working on is obviously sequencing the skin microbiome and looking at the composition of the skin microbiome. Where microbial focuses on the gut, we focus on the skin. So we've developed this whole diagnostic side of the business. We look at the skin, and because it's such an important, it's the biggest organ, But, and we want to look at, I guess it's, maybe that's another podcast we talk about
absolutely.
skin. But more importantly today, we want to talk about your product. Well,
the thing with plant is, like, we wanted to create, basically when we had this idea, it was, we put a bunch of what was on the market at the moment, and there's a bunch of plant protein on the market, and we wanted to create something, well, specifically I wanted to create something that was for the plant-based athletes that could have something that didn't want to go down the path of having whey or collagen or meat products and all that jazz. So we put out a bunch of plant protein, got some feedback on those plant proteins, and, there was, one was gritty, one was didn't taste good, it didn't hydrate well, it didn't shake well, it didn't sit well on my guts. Okay, how can we solve these issues? And typically what people were finding is that it didn't sit well on their guts, that as one of the biggest issues. So how can we make a plant protein that gives a plant-based athlete a boost of protein, but also really covers the base on what is the crux of our health, and that is increasing the robustness of our gut environment at the same time? How can we help to not only yield better health and maybe higher higher protein yield out of the protein that we're consuming, because I'm sure everyone doesn't, metabolize protein. Like I probably metabolize protein different to Matt and different to Shaun and different to Tris. We probably all take, let's say we all took 20 grams. I guarantee all of us would probably absorb and utilize.
I know you utilize yours different to mine, that's for sure.
Different. So how can we, for the everyday person, how can we bolster what they're taking in, and how can we help them be healthier, and not just that one person, but the community, and then the country, and then the world. And our ultimate aim is to help create a healthier world in general. And by doing that, letting you guys work on your secret processes and doing all the cool technical side of things, to be like, how can we make this not only yield a better protein absorption or a better function in our gut, but also yield a better result in every other bit of food that we eat day to day.
That's a good point, because one of the things that we noticed is when we're looking at talking about a plant protein powder, okay, which we're hoping to be used as part of a plant-based diet. Whether you're an omnivore or a herbivore, I don't care. We should be eating a lot of plant, all right? And in amongst those plants, we're going to have anti-nutrient compounds and bits and pieces. And there's a lot of almost like myths. We had to research all these things that were talked about the vegan diet or the plant-based diet, or whatever, which it just spins me out at the vegan aspect of it, because we're still talking about plant-based versus processed food usually. And that's what the true story is. So what we found is they were saying, things like the vegans are deficient in magnesium. And you're sitting there going, chlorophyll's made of magnesium. Magnesium's part of chlorophyll. The plants are green. They're eating green plants. Well, how could you be deficient in magnesium on a plant-based diet? They're finding we've got some binding nutrients. We've got some anti-nutrients that might stick to it and reduce the absorption. So what they do then is they try to fortify the plants with magnesium. You go, well, look, the problem was not that it didn't have magnesium in the first place. The problem was that they weren't absorbing it. So let's fix the gut, the ability to process those, to liberate those nutrients. People go throw it full of iron or B12 because it's not in there, but it's like it has no place in that particular protein. Those other things that you need to fix your healthy gut microbiome for. So that we just had to go back and go through and go, this is not need to throw all of this stuff into a plant protein to fix the vegan diet. The plant protein is also not the sole source of nutrition. So we're hoping to educate people on a variety of foods. This is not just a straight out meal replacement where you replace it now with our plant protein. So we've got to have a variety. So we had to correct a lot of those myths and work out, do we need to bother adding B12? No point if we've got a good healthy gut. Do we need to add branched chain amino acids? I don't think we need that at all. I think actually too much branched chain amino acids is the problem for a lot of people. All these different things that people are fortifying their products with that actually contributed to the grittiness and the gut upset and everything like that. We just needed to make a good plant protein that was good as a plant protein.
Yeah, and I think that's the key. And I've never really found one that kind of ticks the boxes across the board. We wanted to have something with a complete amino acid profile. We didn't want to overload it with branch chains, because if we have a healthy gut, we can create those things, right? If we're in a situation where we're like, let's just say I've done a big training session and I need to repair my muscles, and these things are building blocks of muscle press, skeletal muscle, and my gut will get a sense to say, hey, we need more of these branch chains, let's make them. We can do that.
Yeah
See, it's like that type of stuff is the stuff that like we would only know unless we're listening to this type of educational podcast, where it's just like, well, we don't have to consume branch chains. We can create them in the gut if we've got a healthy microbiome.
We're learning new stuff all the time. I mean, there was a paper released a couple of years ago that talked about the Saccharomyces yeast that's used in proper fermented breads and alcohols in the Mediterranean area, where they have this thing called the Mediterranean paradox, but it's capable of converting oleic acid that's found in olive oils into the EPA, DHA we'd find in fish. So, I mean, even going to show that if you colonize the right microbes there, we can actually acquire the enzymes we need to convert one food form into another food form if that's what we need.
So all in all,
crazy, huh?
Yeah, well, it's super interesting and crazy, and we're just about ready on time for us. But like, just in saying that, so to just wrap it up and conclude, to do things like that, like turning certain fats into the types of things that we need for our body to thrive and to create strong cell membranes and all that type of stuff, diversity is kind of key.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's
100%.
in a nutshell, diversity, and maybe eating that diversity with the seasons, like we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another thing I want to ask these guys too. In your opinion, because you got absolute experts, like geniuses, like brilliant experts. Our shit's pretty amazing, huh? The stuff that we're inventing to add into our plant protein.
Absolutely.
Like it's next
Yeah,
level.
yeah,
Look
shit,
here, we
right?
won't be in this space.
Yeah.
Watch out the microbiome space. This
Yeah.
is the next big thing. They
Yeah.
don't call it the era of the microbiome for nothing.
Yeah.
And if brands and other people are developing products, if they don't think about the microbiome,
Yeah.
they're making the biggest mistake out there in products. Look for products that supports the microbiome. That's key. Look for it. Look for those things. And I'm so glad to collaborate with you guys because it's like seeing that passion for this whole microbiome space and actually doing the right approach. Use science, use what's out there that we know, and taking advantage of that. Otherwise, what are we doing? It's like we have all this knowledge. Like, do you want to still go live in a cave? What do we want to do?
exactly right.
So,
I think we're proving that we do want to live in a cave.
Yeah.
The more we learn, the more we realise it. Yeah, I think we should be eating rotten food in a cave, yes. And I actually don't think I'd mind that.
well, we go back to the fermented foods, and that's no fridges, no this.
Yeah, that's what we have to.
things, and that's kind of back in the day. So,
Oh, guys. Well, look, I just want to say a big thanks from Matt and myself to Trish and Shaun for coming on from Biome Centric. These guys, well, I don't even think we got through even a small portion of what we could potentially get through. So just to wrap up podcast number 2 on the Plant Podcast, I just want to say a big thank you to you guys. And we're looking forward to putting this out. And we're going to come back with a ton more information as we continue on. So, yeah, let's just wrap it up and say
really
thanks.
appreciate it. Thank you for having us.
Great.
Thanks, Sam.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Cheers.